Jesus calls us to choose to be a sheep, to be obedient to the shepherd, to be inclusive. Today is Christ the King's Sunday, and I never understood why it was. In actual fact, I never questioned where this feast and festival really came from. I thought to myself, well, it's the end of the liturgical year before we start the Advent readings and movement towards Christmas. It just seemed like a good place to put Christ the King Sunday. But I discovered this year in my preparation that in actual fact, this particular Sunday only came into being around about 1920, towards or at the end of World War I, in response to nationalism, which was big at that stage, and I suppose in response to the devastation of the war that had raged on. I'm not sure that it's a fitting response these days, but it does challenge us in our thoughts about kings and reign over our lives. These words that were spoken by Jesus has a list of all sorts of things. But these are the absolute last words that Jesus speaks in his preaching and teaching and ministry. Because it's only a hop and a skip, and Jesus is into those final events of being arrested and finally crucified. This is the last things that Jesus says to his audience. And I couldn't help but pick up on these words that Jesus says to those sheep that are gathered at his right. Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And suddenly I thought to myself, these words feel familiar. And then all of a sudden I realized that they sounded a little bit like the Beatitudes, which, as it happens in the Gospel according to Matthew, those are the very first words Jesus speaks when he begins his ministry. The very first sermon that he shares with the crowds that are gathered. And suddenly, when I compared the two texts together, I realized that we had done a full circle back to the same ideas and the same sentiments that Jesus had begun his ministry with. We'd wandered through all sorts of parables and stories and interactions with different people along the way, and each of those stories and parables and interactions were building on the Beatitudes. We're building on that initial foundation. And so we have our final reading this morning, which just completes and closes the ministry of Jesus as the Son of Man sits on his throne like royalty, as he sits on his throne. So friends, we hear in this particular scripture this morning how Jesus separates out the two. The sheep of his pasture are on his right, and those that are named as the goats go to his left. And the king will say that you who are blessed, come and be with me forever. Friends, as we close off this year, there is a temptation that when we look at this text, like so many other texts, that we want to focus in on the judgment that Jesus gives to those goats on the left. It's something that disturbs us when we read it. Those goats, Jesus is condemning them to eternal hell with the devil and his angels. So oftentimes we read this, we can't quite get past that. I suppose we're afraid that when that final day comes and Jesus separates out the two, what happens if we're on that side? What happens if it turns out we're a goat and not a sheep? One commentator said, the judgment that will be received by those goats is because they have chosen to exclude themselves from the kingdom of God.